For a long time I believed that faith was measured by firepower, that God was only on our side, the side that won, the side that survived. I didn't know that one day, the most transformative sound of my life wouldn't come from a gunshot, but from a voice. A calm, steady voice reciting words that cut through the noise of war and the armor of my hatred. In that moment, as I stood before a man kneeling on the ground, I realized that maybe I was the real prisoner, not of him, but of the ideas I had been taught since childhood. My name is Eliav ben David. I'm 50 years old and was born in Tel Aviv, Israel. I served as a soldier for more than 2 decades, devoted to protecting borders I believed were sacred. For years, I thought that duty and faith walked hand in hand. I grew up hearing that the enemy had another God, and that my role was to make sure he never prevailed. Today, what I'm about to tell you isn't just a story of conversion, but the account of a man who had to cross a battlefield to finally find peace. Before I continue with my story of faith, write in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this testimony is reaching. At 18, when I put on the uniform for the first time, I felt as if I had been born for that moment. The flag on my chest gave me a sense of purpose I confused with faith. They said defending the land was serving God, and I believed it. The marches, the chants, the fiery speeches, it all felt like a modern liturgy, a ritual of discipline and strength. With every mission completed, I received medals, handshakes, and looks of admiration. They called me brave, the ideal soldier. But when night came and I took off my uniform, the echo of pride blended with something I didn't want to admit, the fear of not knowing who I was without it. I was trained to see the world divided between good and evil, light and darkness, us and them. They, in my case, had Arabic names, weary faces, and a different way of praying. The orders were clear: neutralize before they attack. It didn't matter who they were, only what they represented. The enemy. I didn't see humans, I saw targets. And with every shot, I felt a strange mix of adrenaline and guilt building inside me. I began to confuse victory with revenge, justice with power. The faith that once seemed like refuge became a convenient justification for hatred. At home, people called me a hero. In the synagogues, they prayed for soldiers like me, and I believed that spilled blood was an acceptable sacrifice before God. But something inside me began to decay. The prayers I whispered before missions lost their weight. I repeated the same words, asking for protection, but I no longer felt like I was speaking to anyone. The faith I had been taught seemed to have turned into a shield, not against bullets, but against conscience. I remember a specific moment, a desert patrol, the sun burning my face and the radio broadcasting a collective prayer for the triumph of our nation. While everyone bowed their heads, I stood still. For the first time, that word, triumph, sounded hollow. What kind of victory leaves bodies on the ground and souls in ruins? Why would a just God take sides in a war born of fear and vengeance? That question haunted me, but I swallowed it, afraid that even thinking could be considered betrayal. Over time, I realized my faith wasn't growing, it was warping. I believed in God, but a God molded in the image of my army, rigid, merciless, partial. It was as if we had tamed the divine to serve our own purposes. And the more I believed I was serving heaven's will, the farther I drifted from it. The pride of a soldier is silent but heavy. It doesn't show itself in battle cries, but in the inability to admit being wrong. I was the man everyone called strong, yet inside I carried fractures no uniform could hide. Deep down I already suspected the enemy I was chasing outside might have been living inside me all along. That realization, slow and painful, was the beginning of what came next. A path of unlearning, shame, and eventually redemption. But back then I didn't know that yet. I kept marching, believing that the sound of boots on the ground was the same as a prayer being answered. War has a cruel way of teaching what fear is and what indifference means. Over time I stopped seeing faces and started seeing only silhouettes. Muslims became a category, not individuals. The uniform, the weapons, the commands, they made me believe I was on the right side, fulfilling a sacred duty. It was easier that way. Obey, act, forget. Thinking too much could be dangerous. Hesitation could kill. So I learned to switch off what made me human. The missions repeated like an endless cycle. Enter, search, neutralize, leave. The dust clung to my skin. The smell of gunpowder seeped into everything, and the sound of helicopters became the background noise of existence. Every successful operation was celebrated as victory, but inside something was rotting. I told myself I was doing what needed to be done, but at night, When silence settled over the camp, the faces returned, not of armed enemies, but of frightened civilians, of children with eyes that seemed to ask why. At first I tried to ignore it. I said it was just exhaustion, the stress of the battlefield. But then came the dreams. Dreams where I saw the same people I had once aimed at, now looking at me in silence. No anger, no fear, just a sorrow I couldn't bear. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, trying to convince myself they were only nightmares. But deep down, I knew. The enemy haunting me wasn't outside. It was what I had become. I started noticing details I had ignored before. An old man picking through the rubble of his destroyed home. A woman covering a relative's body with a scarf. No tears, just resignation. Children still playing in the dust, as if life insisted on blooming among ruins. Those small, almost ordinary scenes began to wound me in a way no bullet ever had. I was seeing humanity where my training told me to see threats. In time I realized I wasn't fighting people anymore. I was fighting something invisible, an idea, an imposed belief, a cultivated fear. The true enemy wasn't the man kneeling in prayer speaking another language, but the wall of prejudice I had been taught to build inside myself. It was easier to follow orders than to question them, but obedience came at a high price. Every successful mission cost me another piece of my soul. One day, as I looked at my reflection in the metal of my rifle, I didn't recognize the man staring back. His eyes were cold, distant, as if life had drained out of them. That was when I understood something simple yet devastating. I no longer needed an enemy to keep fighting. The war was already living inside me, and it was that silent conflict, the most intimate and the most devastating, that slowly began to open the cracks through which the light would enter. It was supposed to be just another routine mission. Identify suspects, capture possible combatants, clear the area. The sun scorched the dry ground of the Gaza Strip, and the air was thick and heavy, as if the earth itself carried the exhaustion of war. When we found the man, he was already wounded. His old age and simple clothes showed he wasn't a soldier, maybe a civilian, maybe a father, maybe just someone in the wrong place. Still, the orders were clear. Anyone who resisted would be detained. He didn't beg, didn't shout, didn't ask for anything. He just looked at us with a calmness that unsettled me deeply. When he was handcuffed, he lifted his head and, with a composed voice, asked for permission to pray before being taken away. One of the guys laughed. Another signaled yes, like someone granting a dying man one last meaningless request. I didn't know why, but I just watched. He knelt in the dust, pressed his forehead to the ground, and began to recite. The language was Arabic, a tongue I had always associated with hostile commands and war chants, but those words sounded different. There was rhythm, sweetness, a kind of reverence I had never heard, not even in the prayers of my own faith. The melody of the Qur'an seemed to cut through the heavy air and dissolve the noise around us. The birds went silent. The wind stopped. For a brief moment, the battlefield fell into absolute stillness. I was watching him, but it felt as if I were the one being watched. Every syllable he spoke vibrated strangely inside me, as though it spoke a truth my soul already knew, but my mind had forgotten. That scene, a wounded man, kneeling without fear in the midst of war, confused me. I had seen people beg for their lives, cry, curse, but never someone surrender with such dignity, not to men, but to God. When he finished, he raised his eyes and said something softly, almost in a whisper, "Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un." One of the soldiers asked what it meant, and the interpreter replied, "We belong to God, and to him we shall return." That phrase stayed in me like an echo that refused to die. I, who had spent my life believing faith was a shield, saw the opposite. Faith as surrender. Not a belief driven by fear, but by the certainty that the soul has a place to return to. In the following days, I tried to erase it from my memory, as I did with everything that disturbed me. But the sound of that recitation kept coming back. No matter what I did, the engines roaring, the weight of the weapons, the shouts of orders through the radios, it all felt small compared to that man's calm. I began to wonder, where did that peace come from? What kind of faith could sustain someone enough to pray in front of his enemies as if their presence didn't matter? That prayer wasn't a ritual. It was an intimate dialogue with something greater than pain itself. For the first time I felt shame. Not for the deaths, not for the missions, but for myself. Shame for never having prayed with that kind of honesty. I realized that my whole life I had used faith as a banner, not as a path. While he knelt, I hid behind pride. That night, lying in the barracks, the words I didn't understand returned to my mind. Soft, insistent, like a memory of something forgotten. I closed my eyes and heard again the sound of the recitation. It wasn't Arabic, it wasn't human. It was as if truth itself was whispering, "You have fought against me all your life." And in that moment I understood. The war I had been fighting wasn't against nations or borders, but against the very God I claimed to serve without truly knowing. For days those words echoed inside me like a melody I couldn't forget. I didn't speak Arabic, but the sound of that prisoner's recitation remained alive, as if something within me recognized its meaning before any translation. A mix of curiosity and unease took over me. I, who had memorized military manuals and patriotic prayers, now found myself obsessed with understanding a phrase spoken by someone I once considered the enemy. I asked the battalion translator to explain what that man had recited. He hesitated, glanced around, then slowly read from a small paper he carried with him. "Say, he is Allah, the One, Allah, the Absolute. He begets not, nor is he begotten, and there is none comparable to him." It was Surah Al-Ikhlas, one of the shortest chapters in the Qur'an, 4 lines. Simple, direct, but as the translator read, it felt as though something broke inside me. All my life, I had been taught to fear a God who took sides, a God who blessed battles and justified borders, a God who was ours, never theirs. But that verse spoke of a creator who needed no intermediaries, no armies, no flags, a God who was absolute, without form, without lineage, without comparison, a God who couldn't be confined within human divisions. It was the first time I had heard something that truly sounded universal. I stayed silent for a few seconds, unable to speak. The translator, perhaps not understanding my reaction, added, "It's a declaration of faith. Many Muslims die with these words on their lips." That struck me deeply. They die proclaiming that God is one, and I, who had killed in his name, had never understood what that meant. That night I opened my Bible, searching for something to contradict it, as if trying to defend the God I thought I knew. But the pages betrayed me. In Deuteronomy, I read, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." In Isaiah, "Before me no God was formed, nor will there be one after me." Even in the words of Jesus in John 17, verse 3, "This is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God." I realized the scriptures I claimed to understand said the same thing. I just never wanted to listen. I began to recall every time I had looked at a Muslim and seen only a threat, every time I prayed for victory instead of compassion. Those 4 lines from the Qur'an were stripping away the armor I had built over decades, an armor of pride, fear, and ignorance. The days that followed were turbulent. I tried to return to routine, to follow orders, but something inside me had changed. Every time I heard the adhan, the call to prayer echoing from the mosques, I felt the same shiver I had felt that day in the field. It wasn't fear, it was recognition, as if a forgotten part of my soul were waking up. I started observing the prisoners when they prayed. Even with injuries, even handcuffed, they found strength to kneel and turn to God. They didn't ask for victory, they asked for forgiveness, mercy, guidance. I, who believed myself to be strong, realized I had never known true courage. They prayed while I hid behind my uniform. One afternoon, the same prisoner who had recited the verse was taken away. No one told me where. Before leaving, he looked at me and smiled. It was a simple gesture, yet filled with something I couldn't name. It was as if he were saying, "Now you know." When I was alone, I took a piece of paper and wrote down the verse. I read it out loud, trying to understand. "He is Allah the One." The words came out trembling, but I felt a strange peace. For the first time, my prayer wasn't a plea for protection. It was a confession of ignorance. I wasn't asking for anything. I was simply acknowledging. In that moment, I realized that faith doesn't begin when you understand everything, but when you have the courage to admit that you understand nothing. And as I repeated that verse, the sound of explosions in the distance seemed to fade away. I, a soldier trained to harden his heart, wept in silence, not out of regret but relief. That man had been made a prisoner, but I, without realizing it, was the true captive, and it was through a single verse that the Most High broke the chains I had forged myself. I returned to the base with an exhausted body, but a mind at war. The next few hours were a parade of thoughts I couldn't silence. I sat on the bed looking at the rifle leaning against the wall, and realized how much that object had become my only form of faith. I believed in it more than I believed in God. I believed that strength, obedience, and fear were the pillars of my existence. But that night, all of it felt as fragile as the sound of wind brushing against the tent. I closed my eyes, trying to pray as I had learned in childhood. The words came out mechanical, repeated, lifeless. Lord of hosts, bless our forces, protect our people. But nothing came from the heart. I realized I was only reciting memorized phrases, empty of meaning. And then, like a distant echo, I heard that voice again, the prisoner's recitation, the same soft, steady, serene tone. It didn't come from outside, but from within. It was as if my own soul had memorized the sound. I stood and stepped out of the tent. The desert sky was clear, scattered with stars, and the cold air stung my face. The base slept, but I felt that something inside me had awakened. I walked to the fence that marked the perimeter and stood there, staring into the void. It was in that silence that the questions began to form, questions the training had never allowed. What if I'm wrong? What if the enemy is actually the man closest to God I've ever met? What if everything I've learned about who deserves to live or die is just a convenient lie? Those thoughts were dangerous. In the army, questioning is betrayal, but they were impossible to ignore. I remembered the look in that man's eyes as he prayed, the calm that surrounded him, even in pain. He wasn't praying for survival. He was praying for something greater, for a meaning that transcended death itself. And I, surrounded by weapons, armored with medals, had never felt so small. In the days that followed, insomnia became my companion. While the other soldiers slept, I wandered through the camp, listening to the distant sound of prayers coming from a nearby village. That deep voice, echoing between the tents and walls, seemed to pierce through the darkness and reach places within me I hadn't known existed. Every Allahu Akbar felt like a call, not to war but to return. I began to notice things I had ignored before. An Arab soldier from our battalion would pray silently, hidden in a corner of the supply room. One night, he caught me watching him and hesitated, perhaps afraid of being reprimanded. I simply said, "Go on." He smiled, surprised. For the first time, I saw up close the peaceful face of someone who didn't need permission to speak with God. I went back to my quarters and tried to read the Psalms, but the words felt distant, written by someone who no longer understood me. I closed the book and stared at the ceiling, trying to comprehend how a single prayer in a foreign tongue could disarm decades of belief. The pride that once sustained me was now suffocating me. I no longer knew who I was. Soldier, Jew, man, sinner. I only knew I didn't want to live blind anymore. One night before dawn, the tension that consumed me turned into something unexpected. I felt an uncontrollable urge to speak, not to my superiors, not to my comrades, but to God. For the first time, without formulas, without rituals, I sat on the edge of my bed and whispered, "If you are the same God that man served, show me who you are." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty. It was presence. The same stillness I had felt when I heard the Qur'an for the first time. No visions, no grand signs, only an unexplainable peace that filled the room and brought tears to my eyes without me knowing why. From that night on, I understood that the war hadn't ended. It had simply changed battlefields. The enemy was now invisible, made of my own doubts, fears, and prejudices, and every sleepless night became a battle between the man I was and the man I was becoming. I didn't know it yet, but that inner conflict was the prelude to a much greater surrender, not to an army, not to an ideology, but to the silent call of a God I was finally beginning to recognize. When I realized I could no longer ignore the questions tormenting me, I made a risky decision. During one of my leaves, I asked a civilian contact to get me a copy of the Qur'an translated into Hebrew. I didn't want to rely on intermediaries. I needed to read it for myself. The request felt as clandestine as it was dangerous. There, in the middle of the conflict, that book carried an explosive weight, not of gunpowder, but of ideas. When I finally received the Qur'an, I hid it inside my locker, wrapped in an old newspaper. I expected to feel a chill of fear when I touched it, but what I felt was a strange reverence. At night, when everyone was asleep, I would light a small lantern and open its pages slowly, afraid any sound might draw attention. It was like holding a secret that could change everything. Right within the first pages, something completely disarmed me. There was no hatred against me, or my people, or anyone. Instead, I found words about justice, compassion, charity, patience, and responsibility. I read about caring for orphans, respecting parents, the importance of honesty. It wasn't the manual of violence I had been taught to fear. It was an invitation to dignity. Each night I read a passage, and with every reading I felt as though those words were written directly for me, not as a foreigner, not as an enemy, but as a human being thirsty for meaning. I read about Jesus not as a god, but as an honored prophet, pure and obedient to the Creator. I read about Moses, Abraham, David. The stories were familiar, but the way they were told revealed a thread I had never seen before. They all called for the same devotion, the same worship of one God. The more I read, the more my inner armor shattered. I began comparing those passages to the notes from the sermons I had heard in the army and in the synagogues. The contrast was striking. Where I had been taught that Muslims were full of hatred, the Qur'an spoke of mercy. Where I had been told that Islam was war, I found the word salam, peace, repeated like a refrain. There were nights when I would close the book and just stare at the cover, trying to understand what was happening to me. I, who had been taught to despise everything that book represented, now felt it was the only place where I could find coherence. For the first time, my faith stopped being a banner and became a search. I especially remember one verse I read in A Silent Dawn. Indeed, with hardship comes ease. The phrase echoed in me like a balm. It didn't speak only of hope. It spoke of a God who knew the pain we carry and promised relief, not victory. And that touched me deeper than any sermon I had ever heard in my life. Over time, I realized I was no longer reading the Qur'an out of curiosity. I was reading it like someone starving. Every word seemed to give me back something I didn't know I had lost. When I finished a passage, I would close my eyes and feel a strange peace, as if I were returning home after a long journey. But fear remained. I read in secret, always alert to the sound of footsteps in the corridor. I knew that if my comrades found out, the consequences would be severe. They could accuse me of treason, mock me, destroy my reputation, and yet I returned to the book every night. The risk no longer mattered as much as the thirst that drove me. It was in that rhythm, between pages and silences, that my vision of Islam completely changed. It wasn't a foreign ideology. It wasn't a cult of enemies. It was a call to surrender, not to weapons, but to the Creator. For the first time, I understood that submission didn't mean defeat. It meant liberation. Liberation from ego, from pride, from the divisions invented by men. One of those nights, I closed the Qur'an and looked at my hands. I, who had so often held weapons, was now holding a book that asked nothing of me except to bow before God. For the first time, I wanted to obey. Not because someone imposed it, but because something within me longed for it. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just reading a forbidden book. I was being read by it. Every page was a mirror, every verse a calling, and I could no longer pretend I didn't hear. I tried to resist the change. I told myself it was just curiosity, a phase, a distraction born from the guilt of war. But deep down, I knew it was something greater. The soldier in me wanted to fight what I felt, but the man being born inside me only wanted to kneel. The conflict was constant, between discipline and faith, between duty and conscience, between what I had been taught to fear and what my heart was beginning to love. During the day, I wore the uniform and followed orders as always. No one suspected a thing. I carried out every task with the same precision as before, but inside something had shifted. The missions no longer felt justified. I began to see faces where I once saw only targets. The eyes of civilians, the cries of children, the interrupted prayers, all of it began to haunt me. I no longer had the same cold blood. For the first time, I questioned whether I truly served justice or merely human pride disguised as a sacred cause. At night, away from prying eyes, I became someone else. I would close the door of the barracks, turn off the lights, and kneel on the cold floor. I didn't know how to recite Al-Fatiha, but I mimicked the gestures I had seen, hands on the chest, forehead to the ground. It was a simple movement, yet it carried a spiritual weight no military ceremony could ever reproduce. In those silent prayers, I didn't ask for anything. I simply gave thanks for being broken enough to finally see. In time, I began to fast. There was no practical reason for it. No one told me to. No one knew. I just felt it was the right thing to do. When the sun rose, I avoided eating. When it set, I would take a sip of water in secret. Strangely, instead of weakness, I felt strength. My body grew lighter, and my spirit more awake. It was as if each act of restraint cleansed another piece of my soul, stained by years of war. But guilt still followed me. The fear of being discovered was constant. I knew that if anyone saw me reading the Qur'an or praying, I'd be labeled a traitor. The army does not forgive spiritual deserters. I spent months living with that secret, carrying peace and fear at the same time. It was like walking through a minefield, only now the enemy was inside me. I remember one night in particular. I was on guard duty, watching the silent, empty horizon. The wind blew hard, lifting sand, and the sky was clear, full of stars. I took the small copy of the Qur'an I kept hidden in my pocket and opened it at random. The first verse I read said, "Whomever Allah guides, none can mislead, and whomever He lets go astray, none can guide." I froze. It felt like a direct answer to my doubts. I closed the book and took a deep breath. I, who had always believed control was everything, began to accept that perhaps I had never controlled anything at all. That reading gave me the certainty that this wasn't coincidence, that faith hadn't invaded me by mistake, but by mercy. In the days that followed, I started seeing every small gesture in a new light. The Muslim soldier in my unit, who always prayed quietly, stopped being the other and became someone I wanted to learn from. One day, without thinking, I whispered, "Assalamu alaikum." He looked at me, surprised, smiled, and replied, "Wa alaikum assalam." Those few words, "Peace be upon you," were enough for me to know there was no turning back. In that moment, I understood that my war was no longer against men, but against the resistance within myself. I began to fight, not with weapons, but with silence, patience, and faith. Each day, the soldier died a little, and the believer was born a little more. I still feared the judgment of the world, but the peace growing inside me was greater than any punishment. That's when I realized the truth that would change everything. The surrender Islam teaches is not defeat. It is the deepest victory, the moment you finally stop fighting against God and begin to walk with Him. During a leave in Jerusalem, the weight I carried felt unbearable. I needed answers, not from books, not from logic, but from someone who could understand what was happening inside me. I walked through the old streets with my heart racing, avoiding people's eyes, as if searching for something forbidden. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for until I saw a small mosque tucked between quiet alleys. There was something welcoming about that modest place, a kind of peace that called me before I even crossed the gate. I took off my boots hesitantly and stepped inside. The floor was covered with simple carpets, smelling of wood and incense. A man with a white beard, dressed in a light robe, greeted me with a gentle smile. The Imam. I didn't know where to begin. I felt shame, fear, and an odd urge to cry. When I finally managed to speak, the words came out in fragments. I told him I was a soldier, that I had spent my life seeing Islam as the enemy, that I had read the Qur'an and could no longer sleep in peace. I said there was something inside me begging to bow, but I didn't know how. The Imam listened silently, without interrupting. His eyes showed no judgment, only understanding. When I finished, he remained quiet for a moment, then said softly, "Allah has already spoken to you. Now it's your turn to answer." Those words pierced through my soul. No sermon, no argument could have said more. He didn't try to convince me or explain anything. He simply acknowledged what was already evident. I wasn't there by chance. We talked for hours. He explained that faith isn't an achievement, but a surrender. That God doesn't demand perfection and only sincerity. He spoke about repentance, about forgiveness, about how Allah transforms even the hardest heart into an instrument of light. Every sentence he spoke felt like it was healing an old wound. When I mentioned the verse from Al-Ikhlas, the Imam smiled and said, "That's the center of everything. Truth is not multiple. The Creator is one, and whoever recognizes Him finds rest." I felt a knot in my throat. Everything I had searched for throughout my life, purpose, redemption, peace, was contained in the simplicity of that statement. For the first time, I understood that God needed no intermediaries, no uniforms, no borders. He had always been there, waiting for me, even when I was pointing weapons at His servants. Before I left, the Imam handed me a small copy of the Qur'an and said, "Don't read it with the eyes of a soldier. Read it with the heart of someone who has returned from war." That sentence was the final blow to every wall that still stood inside me. I walked out of the mosque with the book in my hands, my heart light, and my mind silent. I walked through the ancient streets of Jerusalem, feeling something I had never experienced before: freedom. Not the freedom of victory, but the freedom of someone who finally understood that the most important battle in life is won on one's knees. That day, I realized my search had come to an end. The calling that had echoed within me for months had finally found its answer, and in that moment, without the need for words, I knew my life would never be the same again. The 10th day of Ramadan dawned like any other, but something inside me whispered that this would be the day. I could no longer pretend to be neutral. The Imam's words echoed in every prayer I tried to silence, and the presence of God seemed to surround me from every side. There was no more doubt, only the fear of taking the final step, the fear of the unknown, and at the same time, a deep longing to belong. I quietly entered the same mosque where I had spoken with the Imam. The space was silent, and soft light streamed through the stained glass, painting golden hues on the carpet. My legs trembled. I knelt and stayed there for a few moments, saying nothing. I just breathed. For the first time in many years, I felt that I didn't need to fight, prove, or justify anything. I just needed to surrender. The Imam approached, placed his hand on my shoulder, and asked if my heart was ready. I nodded, tears already running down my face. He guided me word by word, and then with a trembling voice I said, "Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadur Rasulullah." I bore witness that there is no deity but Allah, and that Muhammad is his messenger. In that moment, everything inside me went still. The noise of war, the shouted orders, the gunfire, the memories, all of it was replaced by a pure, deep, absolute silence. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the presence of peace. I didn't feel like I had changed religions. I felt like I had finally come home. Islam didn't ask me to abandon reason or humanity, only pride. And when I let that go, I realized that true strength doesn't belong to those who win battles, but to those who conquer themselves. Today, every prayer is a reunion. Every sunrise is a reminder that God never abandoned me, even when I didn't recognize him. And if this story touched your heart, consider using the super thanks. Your contribution helps this channel share testimonies like mine with more people around the world, because somewhere, another hardened heart may be on the verge of finding the same peace that saved me. Now I carry within me something no medal could ever symbolize: peace. The trenches are behind me, but the most important battle was won inside. I learned that faith is not imposed by force, but shown by example. Every prayer I make is a reminder that Allah gave me a second chance, not to conquer territories, but to conquer my own heart. I've understood that true courage isn't facing external enemies, but looking inward and recognizing one's own flaws. Islam taught me that serving God also means serving humanity, that love and compassion are the most powerful weapons a man can wield. Share this video in groups and on social media. You might be the instrument that helps another soul find the same peace that once set me free. Every click is a bridge that can lead someone from the darkness of doubt into the light of faith. Watch the next video. Perhaps in it lies the sign that Allah prepared especially for you, not as coincidence but as an answer, because nothing happens by chance when the heart is ready to listen.